This is Laycock number 2, demo video watercolor tutorial. I'm Tim Wilmot, watercolor painter and tutor, creating videos up here generally on YouTube and on Patreon. Thanks very much for watching this demonstration of the second Laycock. If you missed the first one, that will be in the description of the video. But this is another part of Laycock, very pretty village. If you're ever in the Wiltshire area of the UK, drop by there. There's a lovely abbey there and these beautiful houses around the village. It's actually quite a large village in Wiltshire. This church here is not the abbey. It's the local village church. I forget the name. But the actual abbey is over to the right-hand side. It's way over to the right-hand side through a park. But here we've got some lovely shadows to deal with and the angle of these shadows. So I always like these 45-degree angles in painting. So there's a strong line there, strong line there, strong line there. Notice they're all parallel as well. I'm going to have a shadow going across the A-board sign as well. So my sign's going to be white. This is like a blackboard. So I'll just repeat that through. Got just a subtle line there as well. And then this shadow's going across the street. I'm going to be changing the cars around. I don't always like looking at cars sideways on. I prefer cars in a composition to be either coming towards us or going away from us. So I will be talking about moving things around in this video. I'm talking about composition. So I'm going to go through the whole painting process as I normally do in this with the outline drawing, starting with a blank piece of paper, the outline drawing, then going through my wash, painting over all of the paper apart from some key areas, and then going in with the darks. Well, that's going to be the key focus of the painting, trying to get these nice shadows right. It's very important to get the drawing right and the perspective. So, we can see here with the angle of that rooftop how we're going down there, and then we can just about get the impression of the right-hand side, that there. And then on the left-hand side, we've got an angle here. This is almost my horizon here, and then ever so slightly, it goes down a little bit there. So I need to get the drawing absolutely right. So I'm going to go through all the stages and demonstration, plenty of commentary along the way. If you want to have a go at projects like this, go up to Patreon, become a member of my little watercolor Patreon club. There's a few places left where we get involved in monthly projects and live streams and sharing images and each other's paintings as well, and some exclusive stuff that you won't find up on YouTube. So take a look at patreon.com/Tim Wilmot, TIMWILMOT. So let's get on with the painting. Paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford as per usual. This is 300 grams, 140 pounds in weight, and cold press surface. Starting as I normally do with my outline drawing and getting in the shape of the rooftops. So some buildings on the right-hand side. Now I need to get these angles right of the gable ends of there's some cottages on the right with two attractive, these triangular gable ends sticking out into the street. And thinking about perspective as well with those. Some verticals at the bottom of those gable ends. Then continuing up to the right an indication of the roof there, and up to my right-hand building. So this will be framing the right-hand side. Little bit of a dip in the roof, which I think is always quite a nice thing to do with these older buildings, just to emphasize their character, rather than having an ultra level rooftop. I think it's always good to have just a little tiny dip. So a car placed just to the right of the center of the picture, which will have a shadow going across it just to emphasize those shadow shapes. A nondescript car. Then there's an A-board sign outside. I think it's a little coffee shop or tea shop maybe, on the right hand side. Over to the left, a more distant car with a shadow going over towards the left hand side. And then the buildings on the left, which I will keep fairly bright. Not too many dark shadows. They're over there on the light, sort of, it is coming from the right, but just a little bit behind my right shoulder. So it's going off in a sort of diagonal, slight diagonal to the top left corner. So it'll be fairly light down there on that left hand side. Now a figure walking up the street, just to create a little bit of balance with the composition, the two cars, the A-board sign and that figure. I think that works for me. Chimneys. And the steeple of the church, which I'm just going to keep very simple, not put too much emphasis on that. I don't want it to come too far forwards. If you like painting projects like this, then take a look at my Patreon site. Go up to patreon.com/Tim Wilmot, where there's regular painting projects, normally on a monthly basis, for you to take part in and get a little bit of feedback from me. And I share the source image. A lot of people ask me for sharing the source image. Well, you can run, if you want to take a look at the source image while you're looking at this video, you can open up another tab or window and stop the video in the opening minutes when I show the source photo, and just keep that as a reference to flick back to, toggle back to. Right, after the drawing, first step of the painting is to lay down a wash for me, and generally it's with the sky. So I've wetted the whole sky area, and now, which makes it easier to lay down a smooth wash, and it's a graded wash. So I'm going to go darker at the top, a little bit lighter coming down to the bottom. Now I need to go a bit darker because the paint will dry lighter. Generally speaking, it is going to dry lighter. So it looks, just mop up some little blobs of paint there. I don't want them coming back into the painting and creating a little bloom on the edge. So just mop that up. Yeah, so it will dry lighter, so I need to compensate and go just a little bit darker for that reason. darker, thicker mix for these rooftops and just mop up the side of that house, or the front of the house. I do want to keep that quite bright, so I accidentally went over the edge there, but quickly just mop it up with a paper towel. Should be fine. And so it's darker and thicker, which means that it's not going to, with the board being on a slight slope, it's not going to travel uphill unduly. So I can get in just a little bit of a soft edge on the roof, on the ridge of the roof. The colours I'm using, as per normal, running from the top: neutral tint, burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt green, cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, Windsor red, light red, that one there, alizarin crimson, bit more ultramarine blue. After the light red, there's a cadmium orange, a lemon yellow, and then across the bottom I've got a lavender, which you might be able to see just next to a shiny blue, cerulean blue, which I sometimes use. I want to get a very bright sky. Right, there is the steeple. Soft edge, just so that's thicker paint against the sky. The sky is still damp, but it's thicker paint, so it's not going to travel too much. And gradually come down the scene, painting around the vehicle, the car. While the surface is still damp, I can still slap in a bit more colour, and a little bit weaker for the walls of the houses. Pretty much the same sort of mixture. Paint around that house, around that figure. Brush I'm using is a mop brush from Raphael, soft aqua, size 6. As I come down to the road, I'm going to go a bit cooler. So cobalt, cerulean. I quite often mix my colours on the paper just to really to keep the flow going, so I'm not mixing paints away from the painting and things have dried up. I like to keep the momentum going with painting. So and the stroke directions I'm using there is just to give a little bit of a hint of the markings on the road, just to add in a few subtle little streaks. You can see there the paint on the right is just beginning to dry that edge, so I need to be working quite quickly to go over that. Now, a lot of this area on the right hand side will be covered up with darker shadows, so I don't need to worry if the paint has dried a little bit too quick. As I come down, I get that nasty edge and I want to make it nice and smooth, so I don't need to worry too much, but I do like to, on this first wash, not have any nasty transitions from where the wash dried, and I'm then continuing on painting the wash, and I get that nasty sort of transition from one area to another. Now, just to remove that little bit of light from those side houses down the left, they're just a little bit too bright, so I've taken the brightness away from the white paper. And now hairdryer time, just to, well, partly just to speed things up so I'm not waiting around, or also if I notice when I did that steeple and the rooftops on the right-hand side, you might see it's just beginning to travel a little bit too much into the sky. So I can get out my hairdryer and slow things down a bit, halt that transition, and also speed up the painting process as well. So I get a really dry surface for the next stage, where I do want some harder edges. So soft edges, where I've done the initial wash and added in the thicker paint. Next step are some harder, darker edges for these shadows, which is a focus of this painting, trying to get in some nice shadow shapes. Nearly done. The next step will be working from the background and slightly darker values, starting with those trees in the background, which will create a little bit of an edge around which will create the form of the background buildings at the end of the street. And I'm using a really old mop brush here that's lost half of its hairs, but I think it's quite good for doing foliage. So don't chuck out your old brushes. There's life in them yet. And this is a really old, cheap brush that's lost a lot of its hairs. Nearly every painting, I notice it defoliating, it's losing a few more. Defoliating, is that the right word? Well, it loses more hairs with each painting, and it doesn't matter if they end up on the surface of the paper. When it's dried, I can just lift it off gently with the fingernail. But I'm using the side of the brush to get the impression of this is March. Is it March? No, it's more April time, and yeah, late March, early April, and the trees are just beginning to come into bud. So the canopy is starting to get a little bit denser from the winter period. And I'm just going around the shape of the outside of the canopy to give the impression of these denser, smaller, lateral twigs going out, extending out to the edges of the trees. And then later on I'll go in with the thicker branches in the middle of the canopies, just to then make them a little bit more tree-like. And there's also some crow's nests in there as well, little blobs of darker colour, which if you've got access to the source photo, you can zoom into and see some of those. I might get those in as well, just to give the impression of the time of year when birds are thinking about creating nests. Now there's a bit of foliage there in the middle. I'm keeping with this same brush, which is quite nice because it's lost so many hairs. It sometimes creates some nice random shapes that you can't really get with a perfect brush. So great for some of these shadows down the end of the street. Cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, bit of burnt sienna. And shadow underneath the rooftop of the end building. Now, I don't want it to be too dark because that's going to bring it too far forwards. But just a little bit of a shadow, not a perfect line. A few little breaks in that line, which makes it look a little bit more natural, and a couple of strokes there for those two windows just coming down from the roof, from the edge of the roof. Some more horizontal little slithers of shadow coming out from the right hand side. If things are a little bit too dark, then I can, before it's had time to dry, I can lift it out. So I just think those windows were a tiny bit too dark. I want them to be pushed into the background. There's not a lot of shadow or darkness in those far windows. So I just lift it out with a paper towel or tissue there, or it could have been a brush. Now, medium-sized mop brush, get a good edge. This is a squirrel mop brush, medium size, maybe about 10 millimeters diameter. All the manufacturers seem to have different numbers. The numbers relate to the diameter of the brush head, but this one is a Winsor & Newton size 4. Yeah, it's a pure squirrel mop brush. But like the Raphael, it gives you it's got a nice edge to it, a nice point, so you can be a little bit more precise with some of the shapes. With these windows, I'm not drawing perfect windows. I'm just creating the impression of these windows, but I do want some sharp corners in places and some hard, straight lines. So it's good to have a brush that I can be a little bit more precise with, like here, I'm holding it like a pen. Whereas a lot of the time, if I want to paint loose, I might hold the brush further towards the end, the opposite end to the brush, so I can be a little bit freer in the movement of the brush. This far car needs to be not too dark. So they're quite simple cars that are coming towards you or going away from you. Just generally, you can get away with it with a dark line for the windscreen and then a dark line for the bottom of the car, the body of the car. And then quickly drop in some shadow, darker, thicker mix for the shadow, and you get a soft edge between the body of the car and the shadow. I've swapped for a smaller synthetic brush just to be a bit more precise with the figure that's walking towards us. Face, flesh colour for the face and hands. I'll keep this figure with a light top and a darker bottom. And shadow going over to the left, connect with the bottom of the figure. A few shadows just behind the figure, almost, I guess, going up to the car. Back to my medium-sized mop brush, that size 4 Winsor & Newton brush, and mixing up now some darker shadow mix. So neutral tint, burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, maybe a bit of alizarin crimson. So it's not a sort of greyish colour. There's a hint of other hues in there, and it's important to keep those shadows just a little bit varied, varying sort of shades of darkness and different colours dropped in. So it's almost a purplish colour now. The important thing is how dark it is compared to the lighter areas around it, these values, these tonal differences. So it could be anything, as long as it's not charcoal grey or black, just this darker colour. Trying to be fairly careful painting around those, painting in the shadow on the shady part of the gable ends of those buildings, and some strong diagonals, the rooftop there between the two gable ends, a little bit of shadow underneath the roof of the gable end, ultramarine blue and neutral tint there. Just pick it up and define the top edge of the car coming down a little bit further. So we've got a few little variations of shadow. Neutral tint, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue. Just take off a little bit of the paint from my brush because it was just too much on there, so I can get a sharper edge, be a bit more precise with the shapes now. Also with the shadows, it's a good idea to try and lay it down all in one rather than doing multi-layers, because you can lose the freshness of the shadows. So I want to try and make sure I don't overwork these shadows. You can always see when you've put down multiple layers in a shady area, because you can never quite get the edges right. A viewer can just discern a slight edge, these two different edges of the two layers when you paint it. So it's always good to do it in one, and you keep that freshness, and you don't get that nasty edges. So a few more 45-degree angles. Do it quickly and then forget about it. Don't go back to it. The buildings on the right hand side, quite a lot of shadow in these. Bit of a jagged edge to that angular shadow, so not a perfect straight line. I've picked up a little bit of yellow ochre there, so it's a little bit lighter, and we can just have a tiny bit of the stone colour coming through. That's the idea. Another 45-degree shadow. And we need to come down to the A-board sign, which would be another hard edge and a bit of contrast between the dark behind and the light of the board. I'm not going to bother with any writing on the board. I'll just keep it as a simple shape. So I picked up just a bit of water to make the mixture a bit weaker. And the shadows going across the car, I'll make a lighter blue colour. Now I need to keep that line across the windscreen pretty much parallel or the same angle to the other shadows. I just think that creates a nice sort of repetition of that angle. A little bit of light on the right hand side of the car, so continue the shadow down to the bottom of the car, and then, as I did with the smaller car, add in some darker shadow, and it's all mixing fairly well. Maybe another shadow coming out from behind the car, pick up a bit of water and a little bit of blue, cobalt blue. Continue on with the shadows going across the street. So this is a lighter shadow than the shadow going out from the car. Shadow across the sign. It's not that angular shadow isn't on the A board in the photograph, but I just think it needed it to create that, again, this repetition of that angle. Now it might look a little bit messy at the moment, but we can strengthen up these shadows and the form of the buildings with some darker colour shortly as a next step. I just want to lay down these main shadow shapes and not tamper with them too much. While the shadows are still damp, I can just move around the colour a bit, extend over to the masking tape, my paper. I should have explained at the beginning. My paper is secured with a bit of masking tape just to stop it buckling too much. And you can still see a shine on the surface. So those shadows, they're still quite moist, they're still quite damp. But I'm now using my small synthetic brush to mix up some darker green for, there's some bushes or trees just beyond the car, and I'm using almost pure paint here, not too much water at all, so quite dry brush marks. Background there is quite dry, so it's not this mixture isn't mixing with that background. Strengthen up maybe some bushes at the back of the street. Then the bottom of that building, just a few marks. Drain pipe coming down there. Add in some chimney pots, some chimneys. Good thing about chimneys, you can always move them where you want to. If you think they're in the wrong position on a house, you can move it. No issue with that, no problem with that. Just to suit the composition. Right, picking up a bit of lavender now for the timbers going across the fronts of these houses. If you ever visit there, when you walk up and down the streets, there's some very attractive timber work, horizontals and verticals, and some of the angles as well, very attractive for these style of. I guess they're Tudor period, so they're quite a few hundred years old, 400, 500 years old. So it just needs some dry brush marks to define those. The buildings on the left-hand side, I'm just creating the impression of different details on the fronts of the houses, doorways, windows, and just, I guess, squinting my eye at the photograph to create the impression of those. Continue over to the right-hand side. Some lines for the tiles, not too many. I find if I draw in each individual tile, it's a bit like painting every brick on a house. It's just too much detail. But you want to give the impression of that brickwork, the impression of those tiles, just by doing a few lines. That's the left-hand side of the church done. So hopefully it just looks like it's not too close to us. Burnt sienna, burnt umber, viridian green, neutral tint, bit of all sorts this. There's some planters and bits of foliage coming out of pots just in the shadows. So I'll just scrape the brush over just to give a sense of something going on there in the shade. So side of a pot, little horizontal coming up to the A-board sign, trying to connect these different shapes together. Left-hand side of the A-board and legs. Up to the car. neutral tint, alizarin crimson. Shadows here, they're getting pretty dry now. So they've just had a few minutes to dry, and that will be just right for dropping in these darker marks for the windows and guttering, doorways, tops of the ground floor windows and some signage. And those are some, that sort of mark, the lines I've painted there, they're the sort of cornerstone of that building, where you've got these large cornerstones. But I haven't done every one, just created the edge around a few of them to give the impression of that stonework on the corner of the house. You can see my brush now it's hardly got any water on it at all. And I like using my fingers to smudge things and blend in the colours a little bit. That's the top of the sign on that tea shop or coffee shop. I've got a rigger brush here from Levinson. Gives me a very fine line. Great for doing twigs. Sorry, you can't see exactly what I'm doing there, but just creating a few lines for the tree trunks and some of the thinner branches that are going out to the edge of the trees, the edge of the canopy. Just continue over to the right. This brush is really good for doing fine lines. I can get the thickness of it almost like a hair. Really good for creating very fine lines. And the colour for this can be anything. Not too dark, but any dark colour that's left in the palette from previous mixtures. This tree being a little bit closer, I can perhaps have some denser branches. So a few more over here. and put in those little crow's nests. Might be a little bit too dark with those, but just some nests up there. A few more horizontal shadows just to fill in that background. I think it needs it at the back there. Back with my small synthetic brush, and another thing I quite often do for roads is to, as a later stage, add in a few dry brush marks for the tire marks, and it helps with perspective and leading you into the scene. Go a bit darker on top of the shadow areas, a little bit lighter outside of those areas. Bottom of that A board. Back with the Levinson rigger brush and some fine lines for just a few of the tiles. Doesn't matter if it's not a continuous line, just makes it a little bit more. I mean, these are old tiles, so some might have been lifted a little bit, or others are a bit more snug on the roof. It just helps with that, the impression of the age of these buildings. As I was saying earlier, don't want to overdo it with these lines, just the impression of some tiling. Few more tire marks, just think it needs a few there. Darker line for the bottom of the buildings on that far right side. Sometimes I will pick up pure neutral tint, but not only just to get a really dark part of the painting where I don't generally mix it with water, so it's just almost pure paint for some key dark areas. A few windows on that bottom building. Try and keep it fairly light though. Down there. Finish off with just a little bit of tiny detail there on those left-hand houses. As I normally do, just a little debrief and self-critique of my painting and the finished painting here. So Laycock, number 2. In a 2-part painting. Might be doing a 3rd one, you never know. But very pretty village in Wiltshire, and focusing on these angular shadows, particularly on the right-hand side. I'm trying to get into dramatic shadows. So thinking about their shapes, the repetition of that, the shapes there, for example, that line there, that line there, a line across the car, the line across the sign as well. And then within the shadow, when I'm painting in the shadows, trying to think about the color of those shadows, not keeping it too, not going for this like a charcoal grey color, but we can see in here there's bits of blue, there's the yellow ochre in there, little bits of red, so warmer shadows, dry brush marks for the foliage sort of in the middle ground of the scene. What else can I pick out? Well, the sky, the wash I did, clean water, laid down, and then as it was still moist, laying in the paint, almost pure paint, to get that graded wash. Dark at the top up there, and then coming lighter as I come down towards the horizon, and then an old brush, using the side of an old brush to scrape down from the canopy of the tree from the edge of the canopy into the middle of the tree to create that impression of these late winter trees. And then thinking about composition. So the placement of the A-board, that car, the two cars, the figure between the two. Nothing too dominant in that middle area there, but something big, on that side. So we've got something on this third, we've got something happening on this third. Just it creates a bit of balance. I could have had actually something over in this area. It's a little bit empty, so maybe that car could have been a little bit more to the left, possibly. I could have had another few figures over here to possibly balance the scene out, possibly two figures. Wouldn't have gone amiss over there. But the focus was, the key thing was getting those shadows right, these nice, these attractive lines and variation in tone as well. So we've got some lighter shadows going across the road. And then in the recess, if I can zoom in the recess of the, right at the bottom of the building, in the darkest areas, deeper shadows. So I hope you like it. Thanks for watching. Catch up with you on the next video.